Welcome back to another Boxscore Geek show. We're going to see if we can talk as many topics as we want today, but basically we've got a 45-minute time limit and a lot to talk about. So we'll get to what we get to. Tentatively, we're going to try and talk daily fantasy sports, the WNBA, and Stephen A. Smith being an idiot. So, all well-worn topics for us. I'm your host, Andres Alvarez. You can find me on Twitter as Nerd Numbers. With me is Patrick Minton, the original NBA geek, who you can find on Twitter as NBA Geek. Give a shout out, Patrick.
Hey guys.
Awesome. And then also we have our amazing producer, Brian Foster. You can find him on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Anything to say, Brian?
Hello, hello.
All right, so two kind of funny notes to start the show. I am obligated to say the first because of our producer. We are an NBA site, and the NBA is back because the preseason is going on. I'm not going to lie, this is going to make a lot of you upset. I haven't really been paying attention because the preseason isn't real NBA. Sorry. It's not until, I think, the 27th or 28th of this month that the NBA is really back. But it is exciting that, people are starting to get ramped up. Players are starting to get some touches. The one note I'll make on the preseason is that Kobe Bryant got back on the floor, took his first shot, it sailed through the air and hit the top of the backboard and went off, which was a lot of fun for me to watch. So there's that. One thing I'll throw out to you, Patrick, I'm going to at least throw my 2 cents on this. This season, am probably not really going to do a lot of work to preseason projections. They're kind of fun, but they are, at least from my perspective, a lot of work, and we're usually a lot off. And I don't really like the comments we get at the end of the season about the stuff we were wrong about and the ignores what we were right about. So if Patrick's interested, if Arturo puts stuff up at his site, Basketball by the Numbers, we might have that. But I myself am opting out this season.
So sadly, I'm not going to be able to go to Vegas in time to place any bets this year, which kind of when you're not really putting down the money, it kind of dissipates your excitement for having a big portfolio and stuff. And I don't really care about the people who say, wow, you were wrong. What an idiot you were. I really couldn't care less. I do find it fun to have a portfolio and track that over the year, especially when there's actual money involved. But I'm going to Vegas towards the end of November, and I could not justify going to Vegas before November 1st. In order to place bets, and I live in a state that won't allow any type of sports betting. I don't actually know. There are some states where you could probably place bets, obviously Atlantic City or something like that. But the only legal possibility for me would be to travel to Vegas, and I couldn't justify the expense. So having said that, I will definitely be putting up some preview type stuff on the site before the season launches, but it's not going to be like it used to be the last couple of years where, we're not going to have actual win predictions with standard deviations, I don't think.
Yeah, and like I said, it's cool, but it's also, at least as a sports provider, some of our most evergreen content, some of the stuff that I link of yours, Patrick, is you had just a good thought, like on Kevin Love or something and the sunk cost. I think I've linked your Kevin Love sunk cost fallacy piece 20 times at least. And that was before we even got together. That's evergreen. But I'm never going to, 2 years after the fact, I'm not going to be 2 years ago, we thought the Warriors were a 40-win team, beginning of the season or something.
Yeah. And honestly, a lot of those good thoughts often come out while you're writing a preview piece. Because I think that's what gets lost is the win-loss predictions, whatever. But I think interesting thoughts about team makeup and team chemistry come together in those pieces, and those are often get kind of overlooked. So I'm going to try to make the previews be more about general trends. By the way, if I don't know what the odds are, but if I was going to place any future bet, it would probably be on Rudy Gobert to win Defensive Player of the Year.
Oh, love it. Yeah, Gobert last year, I would be excited about Utah, and what makes me sad about Utah is that all they really need is a point guard. And point guards, there are a few elite ones that are, of course, hard to get, but there are a lot of reasonable, we watch players like Kyle Lowry and who's the guy, Jeff Teague. Jeff Teague get middling contracts because people, kind of undervalue what they're good at. So it does make me sad that, basically Utah has had this strategy of let's draft a highly touted point guard who usually just has a lot of points and has made this mistake. Well, they have basically had one of the best stables of bigs, this would be fun to look at, Patrick, at some point if I want to put a earworm in your head about like a post idea one of us might do is like just look at the collection of bigs on teams over time. And I think Utah's got to consistently, they went straight from like Karl Malone to Boozer to Millsap. They've always had good bigs.
Yeah, they've always had pretty good front line, but pretty much like ever since Darren Williams left, they have had no backcourt.
Yeah, I say Deron too, which I've heard is wrong.
Yeah,
But
I'm
anyway, all
pretty sure
right.
it's
So
Darren, but
but yeah, and Cowie or Kawhi, it's Kawhi, but we say it a
yeah.
billion different ways. So anyway, first topic, this is kind of funny. As we mentioned last week, hurrah, we got a sponsor, an official one. If you go to owntheplay.com, which is a daily fantasy site, which hasn't had any big data leak problems this week, and use the code GEEK25 to deposit $1. They will give you a free $25. Help keeps the light on over here. If you're interested in getting into fantasy sports, which that's going to be our first topic because it's been an interesting week, it is a heck of a lot of fun. If you do season long, you know what's up. So yeah, Geek25 helps us out, but that actually means we have to talk the first topic. I was debating if I wanted to talk it because it has been a cluster this week. But essentially,
Way to dodge the swear word there.
yeah, I might cuss a little, but so if you've been watching daily, if you don't even know what daily fantasy sports is, it's popped up into your radar this week. Basically, there was a New York Times piece which came out recently, which was riddled with problems, but regardless, talked about a very real issue, which is a employee of the major fantasy site DraftKings released an article on Monday, which is the last day to play football, and it released ownership numbers. So if you look at daily fantasy sports, you might consider it more like the stock market. A bunch of people can all pick the same players. So basically, what's good for you is to have low-owned players that might go off. He released some numbers before the last game on Monday started, and the issue with this was that DraftKings is a site that allows late swap. If you play normal season-long fantasy league, you're used to this. If you find out last second that Drew Brees is injured, you pick up a quarterback off the waiver that's playing Monday, and you take your chances because some points are better than no points. And it could get even worse, where if you know who your opponent, if you play season-long and play head-to-head, if you know who your opponent is playing on Monday, and you were, for instance, allowed to play the same player, you could see how that would be a huge advantage. So
Mhm.
he did that. And so the issue with that is it basically showed that an employee at DraftKings had access to essentially private data before game lock. And the reason that's an issue is that in daily fantasy sports, at least before this week, employees of big companies were allowed not to play on their own sites, but were allowed to play on other sites. And the issue this turns into in the big kerfuffle, it's not insider trading, sorry, but it is an issue. It is a breach of data where essentially an employee at one site could use the data, for instance, looking at good gamblers. I've heard people mention this on like sports betting, that if you knew what the good sports bettors are betting, you could just copy their bets.
Mhm.
And if you've read the great book, man, I'm dropping the name, but it's about the Tim Donaghy scandal, but from the gambling side. They basically mentioned that one of the things they would do in the morning is they would go to the Asian markets, lay down fake bets to start moving the market ahead of time because people would be copying their bets. So this idea of being able to look at trends in betting data on daily fantasy sites and being able to use it to an advantage, well, it caught a lot of heat because the same employee happened to place second place in a major tournament and win 350,000 in the same week. And so that's what's kind of blown up. And from an outsider, well, not an outsider, from watching it, the issue I basically have is all of the daily fantasy sites are saying, hey, look, this guy's a good guy. We don't think he cheated, but he's a good guy and there's not a problem. And this is kind of, I don't know your perspective, Patrick, but it's kind of been driving me a little nuts because you and I both work at tech companies, and I don't know, when I worked at Google, they gave us like a fake coloring book that had our employee conduct code, and basically would say stuff like, hey, if you're working on project A and you know someone at another company working on a similar project, you're not allowed to talk to that person or take advantage of that information. And all of us have those, if you have stock options in companies, they basically will release info that says, hey, by the way, the earnings call is coming out this week. You are not allowed to trade your stock until after that earnings call is over. And
Yeah.
so the issue we're having in daily fantasy sports is basically they're saying, hey, people have access to this data and there are no real restrictions on what they're allowed to do with that data. And that's got some people worried. I would actually argue justly so. And I'm actually getting annoyed at all the people saying, hey, look, he's a good guy. We don't think he did anything wrong, which kind of misses the point, which is saying in other industries, this exact action would basically result in that person being fired immediately. And what the industry is kind of doing is saying there's nothing wrong there. The 2 cents I'll throw behind it, if you're a little trepidatious about DFS, the good news seemed to be the sites have basically been contacted by some attorney generals. They have some professionals that are coming to do audits. They're probably going to do, lock things down. So things are getting better. And it's
Mhm.
just kind of an example of startups that grew way faster than, they had the management to deal with. And that's doesn't look good if you're, plastering ESPN with every ad
Right.
slot there is.
Well, the big thing, one of the things beyond what you say is like, I think the real malfeasance here is on the part of the company, because if this data is truly important, then why does this employee have access to it at all? I mean, I don't, the bigger your company gets, the more important it becomes to actually have access control in place in terms of what companies can do what. So, for example, I used to work at Amazon and I did a lot of database work, but it didn't mean I could go into the database and do a query and find out what you had bought last year, for instance. Like that data is protected. Not just any employee can go grab that data from the database, even if he has access to the database, um, because there's basically a right scheme in terms of what tables can you read from and et cetera. And you know the types of like essentially only the DBAs would be the only ones that would have access to read and write everything, right? And even there, I think, you know, policies come into play, which says, okay, if you're one of the people that are in charge of this data, sorry, you can't bet on other sports sites, right? And I think that it doesn't sound like there's any policies like that in place, or at least if
There
there
weren't
are,
until
they're
this
not very
week.
well enforced. And I'm actually curious, like how this works in real world casinos, because you mentioned copying the good betters. So imagine you are the pit boss. I guess is that the right word? The pit boss of the sports book in like at Caesars, right? Presumably you have access to data like, okay, how are the lines moving? Like, and you can see things like, oh wow, everybody wants to bet the over on Team X in Game X or whatever, and because that's how casinos make decisions to move lines. So so that essentially Vegas wants all the money to be distributed equally on both sides of the line because that way they are guaranteed a profit just on the rake and bad luck can't screw them over. So if you're one of those people, and I'm assuming a lot of it happens with algorithms, but let's assume you're one of those people who has access to the data, and you know the line is going to move up, you could bet the profitable. You can essentially get a discount on that bet versus anyone else that's going to buy like if the over on a team is going to move up 2 points or two games, or sorry, in a game, let's say the over under on a game is going to move up 3 points. You can buy the over for cheaper than anyone else could buy the over if you know that and can buy it like now right before it moves. I'm
That
pretty
that
sure that there are policies in place, if not laws, at least policies in place in Vegas that okay, if you're the type of person that has access to data like that, you can't bet on sports.
Well, yeah, because it's one of the comparisons I heard someone use is like blackjack dealers are allowed to play blackjack. But the key point you brought up there that I think was huge is a blackjack dealer would not be obviously if the blackjack dealer was dealing the hand, they wouldn't allowed to be in the hand as well because they could go, I've got a 19 and I just got an 18 here. I have to hit. I don't have an option, right? Like the dealer's going to stay, you know. And so that's the issue. And so like to what you're saying is I would have to bet and yeah, it's funny. We're going to keep using that word, but I'm going to have to bet that Vegas would have that because Vegas is one of the most, even though they have all these competing casinos, they are one of the most collaborative industries in terms of information they share, right? If someone cheats at, I don't even know the casinos, what the Mirage, then you can bet your butt that Treasure Island gets a little report that says, hey, by the way, here's a picture and the name of the person and the games this guy's played. I've
Right.
seen a few documentaries on that. In fact, in grad school, when I was working on face recognition, one of the hugest drivers of that industry was the casino business because they love the idea of stationary cameras being able to
Yeah.
look at someone and identify that person really quickly. So I can bet that casinos get along. And actually, that would be, there's a lot to say here,
Well,
and I don't want to
because
spread more. Oh,
there,
God.
like there, the common interest of the casinos is if you can simply make it completely unprofitable for a player like that to play, then that person will just leave town and not ever play anywhere, which is in all the casino's interests, right?
Yeah, and so that's what I was going to say on daily fantasy sports is daily fantasy sports right now, and this is very familiar to you and us, reads more like Silicon Valley than Vegas. Because you have these two companies that are basically vying for market share, FanDuel and DraftKings, and they're trying to be, the first person to kind of gain complete market dominance. And I'm assuming they're both looking to IPO for lots and lots of money. And so they kind of snipe at each other back and forth. Last year, a company called Draft Street went under. Well, it was purchased by DraftKings. And right after it was purchased, FanDuel basically said, hey, if you were playing on Draft Street, come over and play on FanDuel. We'll match the amount of money you had on Draft Street up to this much. And then DraftKings said, hey, quit FanDuel. And if you quit FanDuel, we'll match your money up to this much. And, it's the companies aren't really working together yet. This was one of the first cases we've actually seen the companies like issue a joint statement. But the companies still have this like, we want to be the biggest game in town and aren't really collaborating, which is the difference between Vegas. Because if the companies were working together, they probably would have said, hey, we have these employees, these people are starting to bet a lot of money, and it's probably in our best interest to, tell that person to cut it out, even if they don't have access to the data. And if they have access to the data, absolutely. And obviously the issue we saw break this week is that essentially DraftKings had an employee that clearly was able to get access to data before time sensitive stuff was done. And even if he used it or not, that's the big issue. That's the big problem. It would be like, if I went and told you on this podcast, if I was still working at Google, if I told you on this podcast a week before the earnings call, hey, Google's got $16 million in revenue and, this new, the self-generating poster field. If I told you that and Google found out, I would be in trouble, regardless of if you bet on it or I bet on it or any of us shorted a stock or bet or
Hmm.
bet on another company. Me releasing that information on its own, regardless of how I used it, would be a big issue. And that's the only thing that's really kind of driving me batty about this current thing that's taking off is we have all these people saying insider trading, all this bad stuff. And the real issue to me is really to just say, hey, we have these big companies that are now worth over $1 billion that are deeply seeped into sports now, and they really need to like get their shit together in terms
Yeah.
of data and
I think
stuff.
another great analogy would be like internet poker back when we used to be able to play that, right? One of the most valuable things you could have in internet poker was a hand history of all hands played. So you could know for given screen names like how exactly they played any given hand. And the only way to get that would be to basically, be watching that player while he played or to purchase the hand history from somebody else who was watching that player while he played. And that was a big thing in internet poker. Like you could purchase enormous databases of hand histories so that you could get like a huge amount of wealth about how players play and analyze their play. And I mean, it was a pretty big deal. Now imagine you were a employee at a site like, Full Tilt Poker or Poker Stars, and you had access to the hand history databases, and you took a huge dump of all those hand history databases, and then during your off time at home, you played poker on the site versus all these players for whom you had just downloaded a bunch of data that they can't legally get in any way. That's essentially what happened, right? This it's not quite insider trading, but this guy
Well, again,
used
it's
information that no one else could get in that timely manner.
we don't know that happened, but that's the point. The bigger point is, let's say you work at Full Tilt Poker and I come to your house, and let's pretend it's the old days. So you have this big binder on your desk, and I go, "What's that?" And you go, "Oh, it's a bunch of hand history data from players." And then I look at your computer and you're on Party Poker, and I go, "Should you actually have that right there and be allowed to play on Party Poker or whatever?" And you go, I'm not going to use it. Don't worry. Like Arturo's actually been pretty adamant on Twitter about this, and I have to agree with him entirely. It's like, on the one hand, you can believe everybody. You can believe me when I say Patrick's a good guy. Patrick would never, he had to take that binder home for work. Rest assured, he would never look at that binder. He completely understands the moral implications of that, and he would never do it. The bigger issue is someone should go, why the heck does Patrick have a printout of all of the hand histories on his desk? Like, and
Yeah.
why is he allowed to play poker if he's allowed to do that? And that's what's kind of happening. And it's that the problem is you kind of have both sides spiraling out. You have the media basically going, employees are cheating in insider trading, which isn't really, even if what they think is happening, it's not really insider trading, but it's something that hasn't ever been issued in this industry, and that's kind of a problem, and that's what's getting a lot of eye views. That's issue number one. But the bigger issue is everybody in kind of the daily fantasy sports realm, at least that I'm watching, is basically saying, no, we know that guy is a good guy, is a good guy. And I'm going, that's not the point.
It's totally irrelevant. Yeah, I mean, avoiding the possibility of wrongdoing is far more important than, determining whether any actual wrongdoing was done here in this particular case.
Yeah, I have to
Right?
point out
If
that's
it's impossible for anyone to do something illegal, then it won't happen, right? Whereas, like, I guess I just fall back on like, every accountant's favorite or every comptroller's favorite saying, which is trust but verify.
Oh yeah. And what are you going to say, Brian?
oh no, we can keep going.
Oh, come on. You
No, no,
jumped
we
in.
lost we lost the moment. We lost the
You
moment.
lost the moment. All right. Well, that moment brought to you by Brian Foster. Let's actually, I don't have a subtle way to get to this, but let's get on to the WNBA. Um, the reason I kind of was thinking about this, there's two parts. Obviously, your Lynx, who I believe will probably be moving to Oklahoma City in the next few seasons, are in
By
the
the way,
finals,
why do
right?
you think that?
I'm just making a Sonics reference, not a very good one,
Okay.
obviously. Sorry about All right. Well, I'll drop that reference from my repertoire because it's failing on someone in Seattle. And if that's the case, no one, everybody listening to the show is like, what's Dre talking about? Okay. So the Lynx are in the finals. And additionally, I got to see Dave Barry. He and I both went to CSU and he gave a guest lecture at CSU. And I happened to be in town and I was able to see that. And he actually brought up the WNBA. And what was fascinating to me is he mentioned there's a good article. I believe it's on Vice Sports, Brian. But Dave did an article about revenue versus salary in the WNBA and basically said, okay, if we just look at their TV and gate revenues and were to pretend it was the NBA and they got the same split as the NBA players, which is about 50%, then women athletes in the WNBA are vastly underpaid. And I brought this up to you, Patrick, in an email. And the reason it was fascinating is you brought up that unlike other sports leagues, the WNBA actually has competitions from other leagues that can offer comparable salaries.
Yeah, and I think that I mean what's interesting is I think there's a bit of a top heaviness bit at play, um but players like Diana Taurasi and Sue Bird and etc. They actually make far more money overseas than they make playing for the WNBA. So it kind of really surprises me that the WNBA can get away with this while still retaining their their stars. And in fact, they weren't able to retain Taurasi because essentially uh, her team in Russia said, "Look, why don't we just pay you more money than the WNBA would pay you, and in exchange, you don't play there." And she said, "Okay, that sounds like a good deal to me." So she gets the rest, and she makes more money than she would have otherwise. And I think more and more of that is probably going to happen, at least as long as women's basketball remains popular overseas, because it's kind of one of these weird situations where, men's basketball is far more popular here than it is over anywhere overseas, but the reverse is probably true for women's basketball. Women's basketball is more popular and has more money in several countries than it does in the U.S.
And so I'm curious because
Or
didn't
at
you?
least,
So
I
what
guess,
level did you coach at? Because you coached overseas, right?
it was in Germany, and it was you would call it Oberliga, and I guess so. If the top is like the German Bundesliga, and then there's Bundesliga one, and then there's Bundesliga two, and then there's Regionalliga, which is like um, like Southern Germany versus Northern Germany, right? And then there's a few leagues underneath that, and that's the level that I coached at.
So you were this close to the majors in German basketball coaching,
If
is what you're telling me.
this is about 5,100 million miles, yes. I will say that it was a strong enough league that the German, like, because everything is regulated in Germany, right? So you had to have a coaching license in order to coach any kind of basketball. And the licenses were A, B, C, and D, where D was like the worst or the lowest level. And to get a D license, all you had to do was like show up for a weekend seminar, and they would tell you the absolute basics about basketball essentially, and they would tell you most importantly a few like health tips, like what to do if somebody sprains an ankle, etc. And you got your D license, and then your C license was like again, it was like a week somewhere. Um, and you needed a C license to coach at like the second or the third from the bottom. And then I played at a level which was the lowest, or coached at the level of, it was the lowest threshold where they required that the coach have a B license. And to get the B license, I had to go to a week-long seminar, and there were coaches there who like had coached like the national team or the junior national teams. There were like really good coaches were there. Um, and then in addition to that, you also had to do like a certain number of sort of internship hours where you had to contact professional coaches, and they had to be of a certain level, and you had to like go and watch them practice or learn from them or whatever. And the most of what I did there is I went to the Detlef Schrempf camp that he held one in Munich every year for like pretty much the best German youth players got to this camp, and and he did a lot of coaching himself there too. And so he and a lot of like really good coaches were there. So I went to that camp. That was like a week, and then I also spent a weekend watching the U19 team play. And this was the team that at the time Dirk Nowitzki was on right before he got
Freaking
drafted.
awesome. And
So
so, by the way,
it was kind of funny because back then, watching that team, you could tell his coaches had the attitude of Dirk Nowitzki, that he was this super talented kid who did not work hard enough because he knew he was going to be drafted, and they were like, "Oh, he's lazy, he's not working hard enough," which is hilarious because looking back, he's clearly, over his NBA career, he has clearly been one of those players who has worked his ass off and has done so much every offseason to either stay in shape or get better. Like, it's
Isn't
hard
his
to
father a coach or something like that, and they worked together for a long time?
know.
There's a whole story about his routine.
His longtime mentor is a guy that many other coaches in Germany do not get along with. His name,
Oh, interesting.
his name's Holger Geschwindner, and
Yeah, that guy, that guy.
he actually wrote like one of the first books in Germany that ever was published about basketball. But it has a lot of very old school ideas in it. Ideas taken from like handball or soccer or other sports, and a lot of the modern coaches in Germany who would rather take ideas from America don't really get along with him. And I think Schwinder's really interesting because he's kind of one of those, guys who just thinks totally outside of the box and approaches from a different direction. Um, and he's clearly been very influential on Dirk Nowitzki in his training. And
so one question I have for you on that, because the point you brought up was the whole issue of, hey, they can go overseas. At least reading like Paul Shirley's book on, U.S. players playing, a lot of leagues have quotas on foreign players that are allowed to play and restrictions. So does like female sports, at least in Germany, do they have restrictions on that? Because that's like
yeah,
really I would imagine that's the only thing keeping like German teams from just buying a WNBA team. Because if
yeah,
you're able to pay $1 million to a player, in theory, you could just buy out a WNBA team and offer to bring them over.
right. So you can have two foreign players on the court, and I think three on your roster, or is it two in the lineup and three in the roster, something like that? And then I think and that's for by foreign players. Those are players who don't have. So it depends on the league, right? So if you're in Germany, for example, I think anyone who is an EU citizen, regardless of what country, as long as they're a citizen of the EU, I think that there's like more exceptions for those types of players. But you can only have two players who are not EU citizens active, and I think three on the roster. So that was always a problem for me, even because, and this rule applies to all leagues, not just the professional ones. So that was always a problem for me because, like, obviously I'm American, and even in like the sort of uh, leagues I was playing in, which from a talent perspective, we're probably talking about the equivalent of like high school basketball or like varsity high school basketball, but they were men's leagues. And even there were like you could only have two foreigners. So often it would be like me and like some guy from Spain or something. And then before they introduced the EU rules, like if there was a third guy from Yugoslavia or somebody, like the three of us would be duking it out to see who actually got to play because you could only have two of us on the roster.
Jeez. One note I'll make on the WNBA is it doesn't seem like having ads on the jersey seems to do anything, because I just looked up I just looked up the scores to see what the series is tied at, which is fantastic. Minnesota versus Indiana. Wow, talk about two good markets. Are tied 1-1, so that's definitely this week's poll. And there is a fantastic ad for the Mayo Clinic right on WNBA.com, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the funny thing about the WNBA, another point I'll bring up, and sorry, like you and I, like, yeah, we've both been busy. So football's been keeping me busy, and I know work's been keeping you busy. So not as much time to watch the WNBA. But what I would point out that's interesting, that's another point from Dave, is if you look at the WNBA's numbers, which is about 7,000 people per game, which is why we scoffed at the idea of giving them a free, I'll put that in quotes, stadium that only seats 5,000 people, is it's in much better shape than any of the other major leagues were about 20 years in the United States. And
Yeah.
one of the issues you're pointing out here is that they're not really doing anything in their interests to really build the brand because one of the big issues, this was actually the ABA actually managed to do this right, which was to say, look, we can't compete with the NBA right now in terms of overall profits, overall revenues, but what we can do is we can offer lots of money to stars to try and get more stars in the leagues. And in fact, this was one of their biggest blunders. They were trying to vie for Kareem Abdul-Jabbar back when he was Lou Alcindor. And they basically had a battle plan, which was they were going to go in with a briefcase. They're going to open up the briefcase. They're going to pull out a check for $1 million, hand it to him, or put it on the table, and basically say, you can play wherever you want. Come on, Kareem. And then at the last second, one of the guys in the meeting decided to haggle with Kareem. Kareem didn't want to haggle. Kareem got an offer from the NBA that was marginally better than the haggle deal and went to the NBA. And as soon as that was made, like they had done a player profile of him, and I don't know how much stock to put into this, but basically their thoughts were Kareem was pretty loyal. So as soon as Kareem said, I'm playing in one of these leagues, it was over. The other league didn't have a chance, even if they came back with more money. So to the point of like the WNBA, essentially they're letting the exact opposite happen. They're saying there's these other leagues that are able to come up with lots of money and steal the stars, and they're not really doing anything against it. And the point Dave made is to get a league to get popular, you kind of need to get a cultural kind of relevance of it. You need a history. And it's really hard to get a history if there aren't persistent players, persistent dynasties, things like that, that all these other sports leagues have. The reason baseball can have so many fans is even as a Colorado Rocky, I'm not really a fan at all, but they played in the state I was in. I got to see Dinger's appearance. He's the mascot. But you know, they've been around over 20 years. So like even the youngest baseball teams are older than like the WNBA. And if you want the WNBA to grow, you kind of have to actually build it to your audience. And a lot of stuff they don't seem to be interested in doing.
Yeah, it does seem really weird to me, especially because I mean the nickel and diming at this stage of their growth does not. If you look at the way most people choose to grow businesses, um,
Well, we were
you
just
know,
talking DFS. Like basically, they are
yeah,
throwing millions of dollars at advertising, and their entire logic is we need to grow a user base before we're
yeah,
even worried about being
like
profitable.
and I will say that the WNBA, at least from my experience here in Seattle, is very good at trying to make their stadiums full. Like if, at the last minute, if no one's in the stadium, they will lower ticket prices drastically, which the NBA doesn't need to do or doesn't do. Like I don't, I feel like you don't see that happening in, for example, Philadelphia or Charlotte or other places where the team stinks and the attendance is terrible. Um, but it seems like they should be trying very hard to prevent things like what happened with Diana Taurasi and just making sure that they put a good product out there and not really caring about profit margins until the league has grown to a certain level. So what is it? Is it like 13 years old? Is it really 20 years old?
I feel that's about, I mean, it might be younger than that. If it's 13 years old, it's even because the number Dave used was about 20 years. So
Yeah.
let's see. I
Well,
think you're
like
right. Like if we look
it's
at
pretty
basketball,
close. It was definitely wasn't it in the 90s when the USA team with Cheryl Swoops.
It was
Uh,
founded April 24th, 1996.
way to be on
yeah,
the
so
So
it's
ball.
close.
almost
So
It's
20
almost
years.
20
exactly
years,
20.
and they did expand like too much early on and then had to contract again because they just weren't making money. But it feels like they're going about it in a more profitable manner. And part of it now is like they have a they have a real niche. Like there definitely are a lot of Storm fans, particularly women, who are not, NBA fans. They are strictly WNBA fans. And that's a real niche that the WNBA should be trying to expand. right? And I think there's a couple ways to expand. One is to get more NBA fans to watch the women's game as well, and and another is to just kind of aggressively pursue that niche and try to widen that niche more. There's just a there's a pretty huge audience of women and young women and girls who love the WNBA but aren't necessarily NBA fans.
What? Yeah, I
And
mean, I can 100% agree with that. And one thing I'd be curious about, because I'm not in any of the cities that have both. I've not, I think Denver briefly did, but I wasn't around for that. But like, I would be interested to talk to someone in, say, Chicago, because I know for a fact that if I buy, I still get emails from the Boston Celtics, because when I went out to Sloan a few years back, we went to a Celtics game
mhm.
and I bought it online and I gave my email. And so they periodically are like, want to buy tickets to a Boston game, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm really curious how aggressively the teams that go, hey, you're a Bulls fan. Hey, if you want to, you bought season tickets to the Bulls. If you want to get, half off tickets to the Sky, why not?
Yeah, I don't know. I am obviously also in a city that doesn't have both. I am newly minted season ticket holder for the Storm, but
But as you
I
pointed
obviously
out,
don't
even
have an
there,
NBA
like
team.
you
What's that?
were saying like your fiance Karen wanted to get like a Seattle Storm shirt and couldn't. You're in Seattle, like that should be the easiest
Yeah,
place to
she
find it.
actually had trouble buying a shirt because we went to a game, so she wanted to get a shirt to wear to the game and had trouble finding it in any store in downtown Seattle. So like she had to go to the arena to get a shirt, and by then she was like, "Oh fuck it," you know. And it's like that's crazy. Get
Ab-
your
ab-
product on the shelves. Pay some money to the stores to get your product on the shelves.
So absolutely. By the way, I don't have any shout outs prepared. We're at 9:25, and I think we've got a hard stop at 9:30 my time.
Hard
So
stop because I got to go play
yep.
basketball.
And then Brian, I think, has a hard stop too. I'm the only one without a hard stop here, and I'm not going to talk on my own. So anyway, the last I don't really have any shout outs prepared. If you do, raise your hand or let me know. But I did want to at least get a brief Stephen A. Smith bash because we can't avoid this guy. He's crazy. And this one thing I'll say about him is that he basically just verifies time and time again, Stephen A. Smith is just validation that ESPN is not a news organization because he basically made up, maybe it's the truth, but he said, I've heard from people close to Kevin Durant that he wants to go to the Lakers. And Kevin Durant said, excuse me, I know where I'm thinking of playing or whatever, and I haven't talked to anybody and none of them talked to you, so you're making this up. And Stephen A. Smith basically came back and said, hey, Kevin Durant, you don't want to make an enemy out of me, which seems I mean, he's a brilliant villain. I think the That Thing You Like
Yeah.
podcast tweeted us. That's a brilliant villain move because in what other industry would you go up to the biggest star in the industry, point at them and say, I'm a reporter for ESPN, person that is worth $100 million and can literally make, the teams are going to be falling over backwards to get in 2 years. Don't you dare make an enemy out of me. I mean, I'm willing to bet, like, if Kevin Durant called up ESPN, he could, if he really wanted to, pull the clout, could get Stephen A. Smith fired. Stephen A. Smith can't do anything to Durant.
I think it's hilarious that he thinks he has more power than Kevin Durant because obviously, if ESPN is ever forced to choose, uh, you know, Stephen Smith will be flying out the door really fast.
Kevin Durant could.
Um,
I mean, NBA players have done this for more petty reasons. For instance, I heard Marcus Camby never liked playing in Toronto when he was with the Nuggets. I think I looked at the game logs and it's true. He was always, he was an injury prone player, but it was interesting that his injuries always flared up around Toronto because he, had bad experiences there. It's like if Kevin Durant just goes, oh, there's an ESPN game on, got to get my ankle taped, you know,
mm,
can't play tonight. So, yeah, if that ever came down to it, and I mean, I don't have much more to say. Brian's made this point a billion times. Essentially, Stephen A. Smith is paid by ESPN for a role. And what's kind of brilliant to me is it gets the internet outraged. And you can tell by the fact that ESPN refuses to fire him or really even discipline him that they love it, that they go, hey, just go out and troll the internet and we'll get page views and we don't care.
No,
troll the
when he
world,
said,
man.
you don't want to mess with me, just the way he did it was, he kind of moved forward a little bit, paused, pointed his finger into the camera like this, and said, you don't want to mess with... It's like Rowdy Piper almost. I often
Wow.
feel like he was chuckling at the end. I don't think he was being that serious, but I don't know. He's a funny guy. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, it's the idea that he's, responsible for any actual news or breaking stories is kind of laughable.
Well, what's funny in this industry, and we've talked this before, is that there are people that do breaking news, but it's the most hilarious industry to put the amount of effort you have into it because, you know, if you're trying to break news like we were talking insider trading, if you're not in the industry and are trying to speculate on what Google will do, that's huge because they're stock people that can do something with that. If you're trying to break a news story about where a basketball player is going to go, one, there's a set limit of time that it's going to happen. You know what's going to happen. It doesn't really impact you beyond, oh, my team might be better or worse. So the people that are trying really, really hard, and they break it, they don't break it by days or weeks. They basically make stuff up days and weeks in advance. And then about, a day before it actually settles in the dust, they break the story. And we've even seen that's not even set in stone. DeAndre Jordan broke and then a week later changed his mind because the rules said it wasn't set in stone. So that's the funny thing about this news, I'll put that in quotes, industry here, is that they're not really breaking anything important and they're trying to act like it is. And I say that as a sports fan. But, that's the note I'll end us on. If any of you, anything else to end the show on, Patrick?
I just want to give another shout out to Flip Saunders, whose health has apparently taken a turn for the worst. And I'll just repeat what I said last time I gave this shout out, which is to fuck cancer. Fuck cancer. Fuck
Agree
it.
with that. I think I'll put that in a book or something.
Fuck that cancer.
Yeah, agree with that. Anything from you, Brian?
I just got a couple of quick ones. We were talking about this pre-show. Greg Howard on Deadspin had another entry in his series on Whitlock and the Black Grantland. Really great series of articles. Maybe we'll talk about it more in future shows. And there's also Stephon Marbury's $15 sneaker line. He's going after Jordan, saying he's robbing from the hood. Like you guys were saying, there's luxury goods and people are happy to pay more than that, but interesting approach Marbury's taking for his promotion. And the last one is Thabo Cephalosha's trial in Atlanta is going on for when he was, got his leg broken by the cops, I guess. And there's a guy who's an Atlantic public defender there actually live blogging from the courthouse. So we'll follow that as well. Maybe we'll talk about that in a future show. That's all I got today, guys.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, if you send me that link, Brian, I want to follow that account if I'm not already. All right.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's been the Boxscore Geeks show. If you found us not through the site, we're at boxscoregeeks.com. Follow us on iTunes and Stitcher. We're the Boxscore Geeks show. Subscribe, upvote, really helps us out. We are live sometime. We're still figuring out what day we're deciding to go live. This week was Wednesday. But twitch.tv/nerd numbers. If you follow us on Twitter, we'll let you know when we're going live. And of course, we archive all of those shows if you want to get the video footage on YouTube channel Nerd Numbers. So with that,